Hi, we're going to be looking at Hakuin Zenji's Song of Zazen over the next 8 weeks, and some of us thought it might be helpful to have a little bit of context around Hakuin Ekaku and also around the mindset, the fierce and compassionate and often funny mindset of Hakuin Ekaku in writing this piece. Hakuin Ekaku is one of those people that you can find a lot written about him online and Wikipedia and so forth. Some of the really common things that headline who he was: that he reformed the Rinzai school back in 17th century Japan, and he was the developer of our koan curriculum. He was also known as a poet and a famous artist during his time as well. His Torei Zenji, his successor, described him physically as lumbering like an ox, but fierce like a tiger. And that really comes through a lot in his writing, as well as in the fierceness, though, we include compassion and humor in terms of how he wrote and what he wrote about and who he ended up spending his time with. At the age of 10, though, in what has to be seen as a very poor parenting decision, his mother brought him to see a lecture, to listen to a lecture about what would happen to us if we fell into hell, if we were a person of poor character, if we hadn't developed ourselves in a certain moral sense. And the priest went into vivid detail of fires and torture and so forth. And for the young Hakuin, had left a very deep impression. And he, for years afterwards, had trouble sleeping, had trouble falling asleep, or would wake up in the middle of the night crying out in fear. And these visions of hell just stayed with him. They cycled through him, recycled through him, until finally, in order to try and alleviate his fears and to escape from this fate that he thought he was doomed to, he became a Zen monk at the age of 13. And these fears continued to torment him once he became a monk, and developed in him a very strong and disciplined and almost desperation to his practice, or determination in his practice, that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Although the fears, around the age of 22 or so, he had a very big kensho in which those fears dropped away, the discipline and the fierceness of his practice remained. There's a lot written about him. In fact, he's one of the few Zen masters to have written his own autobiography, and we have that here. This is Wild Ivy, translated by Norman Wendell, where you can read a lot of this. There's, I believe, a newer version of his autobiography, more complete version of his autobiography, very long piece that's currently out. I just haven't afforded to buy it yet. So it's interesting that we have this resource of being able to hear about his life in his own words. I won't go into a lot of the details the stories, but he has some great stories. At one point, because of his fierce practice, he became very ill, and he was actually, coughing up blood and so forth. And in order to heal himself, he found this Taoist master living up in a cave on a mountainside in the middle of nowhere, and he had to find, like a wood chopper had to give him directions where this crazy guy lived, and he went and sat down with the Taoist adept, who gave him some practices to do that healed him and brought him back into good health. Eventually, though, by the time he was in his 40s, he'd left the city, left the major centers of practice, and he became the priest of a tiny, run-down, collapsed temple in a far-off little, farming village. And the roof had collapsed in the temple, so that when it rained, in order to go into the Buddha hall, he had to wear a raincoat. And in fact, the Buddha hall filled with water, the floor filled with water whenever it rained. And there was no roof, and it was just a tiny collapsed Zen temple that he found himself in. But this is the place when he was around 48 or so, sitting up late at night doing Zazen, again, still very dedicated in his practice. He just sitting up late at night, he heard the sound of the crickets. And in that moment, he had what he considered to be his greatest opening. And just like when he was in his 20s and had the opening that relieved him of his fears of hell, This one turned him from a strong self-disciplined practice in order to realize his own enlightenment. He also very clearly realized the vows to save all beings, and how he needed to help alleviate the suffering of others. And so at this point, he began to travel the countryside, travel Japan, and became a bit of a rock star for his lectures on the Heart Sutra, particularly. And this is another thing we have of him. Zen Words from the Heart is an account of what he wrote down about those lectures. And it's a very stylized language in many ways, but it's language you can really clearly see that he was appealing to both monks and nuns and people who would, intelligent, literate people who would normally be attending the lecture, but also he wrote it in a vivid way so that it was appealing to everybody. The opening remarks begins, he's talking about the Heart Sutra, so it's Avalokiteshvara and Shariputra. In this, Avalokiteshvara is a blind old futzer, and Shariputra is poor Master Fu. So blind old futzer down in a dark cave, thick with a maze of vines and creepers. He comes back and sits stark naked in the weeds. Pity about poor Master Fu. He's going to lose all his lovely mansions. And don't say these words are cold and indifferent, that they have no taste. One bellyful eliminates hunger until the end of time. So you can hear this strong practice, but also eccentricity and humor in how he wrote this. He spent a lot of time, as a Zen master. He ran this temple and so forth. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think it's so important to recognize how much time he also went down into the town and talked to the farmers, the shopkeepers, and so forth. He recommended, and we have some calligraphies that he gave to some of these shopkeepers, saying, in order to have good business, you must first realize the sound of one hand, and you must treat your employees well. There's lots of great stories about him. My favorite is a story of Granny Asan of Shinano and Hakuin. Granny Asan, an older woman, had already had an awakening, and he gave her the koan, "What is the sound of one hand?" to test her. And she replied right away, "Better than listening to one hand, let's use two hands, clap hands, and do business." Hakuin replied, "Well, if you can use two hands, you don't need to hear the sound of one." And he painted her a broom as a symbol of approval. Back in those days when someone had passed their koan, you gave them a piece of calligraphy to signify this. So he drew a picture of a broom and handed it to her and said, "Now, you give the inscription." And so Granny Asan wrote, "This broom sweeps away all the bad Zen teachers in Japan, especially Hakuin." And they both roared with laughter. So that's a bit of who he was as a person. After these lectures, though, as I mentioned, he was very popular, and hundreds of monks and people who wanted to be monks traveled all over Japan to study with him. But remember, he lived in a tiny, rundown temple, and he had no place to put them. He had no way of feeding all of them. And so a different sort of pattern began to emerge than we would normally have in such a situation where someone comes to sit with a priest. Normally they'd be given a bed, a place to live, some food, and so forth. But he had none of those things. So they ended up dispersing over the countryside and through the town. Many of them lived under eaves of barns or in old disused pagodas and so forth. And because of this, only the fiercest and the most dedicated and most ones willing to discipline themselves to live in these conditions managed to stay with the practice and stay with him. So he inspired with this non-regular way of keeping care of his students. He inspired a very strong following in this way. But also, because there was no central location for them to come every day and so forth, the monks organized themselves a very similar way to our Sangha-led Sangha. The monks themselves formed and maintained the monastic system together and the Sangha. Again, all of them, like Hakuin, very deeply motivated, disciplining themselves, and started to form a new way of governing themselves as well. So, let's bring this to a close. What is the mind of Hakuin? What happens if we look at the human experience that's behind the Song of Zazen? We've mentioned Kensho, how big Kensho was in the life of Hakuin, and he strongly railed against quietism in Zazen, people who just sort of had a moment of emptiness in their lives and just sort of sat with that over time. He said, you really need to awaken and keep on awakening until it all breaks apart. Zen is about waking up, but he also said that it's not something that we attain or that we gain or win by being good and wise meditators. We're always reaching past what's already right here. And you can still clearly hear that in the Song of Zazen, like a child of a wealthy home wandering among the poor, or nirvana is right here before our eyes. So the strong dedication practice to the Kensho, but also to not look far away for it, but to recognize that this is something that is your birthright already. And also that we vow to wake up all beings. And once again, in that clear, direct language written for anyone to understand, all beings are Buddha, just as in ice there is water, or singing and dancing are the voice of the law, amidst the water, crying out in thirst. Very vivid, felt language that anyone can take in and see the immediacy of this. The Song of Zazen, for me, is the work of a very wild and fearless and integrated mind. And what's more, it's something that inspires in us, in reading it, a wild and fearless and integrated mind as well. I think this is going to be a great time to really look into this together, and I look forward to hearing what comes up in our explorations. Thank you.